The dust devils came with the devil himself that morning, spiraling through Lonesome Spur like harbingers of hell. Clara Merrick stood at the edge of Main Street, her bare feet planted in the scorching dirt, watching the whirlwinds dance between the skeletal remains of abandoned storefronts. The sun hammered down mercilessly, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat that made the dying town look like a mirage. She knew he was coming before she saw him. The clatter of hooves on hardpan and the jingle of spurs, the way the few remaining townspeople suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Luther Crow rode into town like he owned it, which Clara supposed he did. His black stallion kicked up clouds of alkali dust that caught in her throat, but she didn't cough, didn't flinch. 18 years old, and she'd learned that showing weakness was like bleeding in shark water. Behind her, the door to Murphy's saloon creaked open. Her father stumbled out, already drunk, though the sun hadn't reached its peak. James Merrick had been a proud man once before. The drought killed their crops, and the bank took their land. Now he was something else entirely, something that made Clara's stomach turn with shame and rage. Now there she is. James called out, his voice thick with whiskey and something worse. Pretty as a picture, just like I told you, Mr. Crow. Luther dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator. 40 years old, broad-shouldered with steel-gray eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they fell upon. His suit was fine black wool, impractical for the heat, but effective for intimidation. A pearl-handled Colt rested at his hip, and Clara had heard the stories about how quick he was to use it. "Turn around, girl." His voice was soft conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying than shouting would have been. Clara's jaw hardened. She met his gaze instead, letting him see the fire that burned behind her green eyes. "I'm not livestock, Mr. Crow." Luther smiled, and it was the cold smile of a man who enjoyed breaking things. "Everything's livestock if the price is right." He reached into his vest and withdrew a leather pouch. Coins clinked as he tossed it to James, who caught it with greedy, trembling hands. $50 as agreed. She's worth every penny. The sound of those coins would haunt Clara for years, 30 pieces of silver in a pouch of worn leather. Her father's face flushed with relief and alcohol as he hefted the weight of his daughter's price. "She's all yours, Mr. Crow. Knows how to work hard, this one. Won't give you no trouble." Luther's cold fingers wrapped around Clara's wrist, and she felt the chill of possession in his touch. His grip was iron strong, confident, the grip of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. "Oh, I'm sure she'll learn not to give me trouble. Won't you, Clara?" She wanted to spit in his face, wanted to claw at his eyes. Instead, she looked past him to the horizon where the mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky. Somewhere out there was freedom. Somewhere out there was a life that didn't involve being bought and sold like cattle. All she had to do was survive long enough to find it. The dust devils spun faster now, as if feeding on the violence in the air. Clara let Luther lead her toward his horse, but her mind was already working, already planning. She had been sold, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. The Crow Ranch sprawled across the valley like a festering wound, all barbed wire and weathered wood, under a sky the color of old blood. Clara's first glimpse of it came at sunset, when the failing light turned everything the hue of dried rust. Luther's ranch hands watched their approach with the calculating eyes of vultures, and she could feel their stares crawling over her skin like insects. The main house was a 2-story structure of dark timber and stone, imposing in its ugliness. Wraparound porches sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect, and the windows stared out like dead eyes. Everything about the place spoke of control, maintained through fear, the guard dogs that snarled from their chains, the rifle rack visible through the front window, the way the bunkhouse fell silent as they passed. "Welcome to your new home." Luther said, his voice carrying a note of proprietorial satisfaction. "You'll find I run a tight operation here. Every man knows his place, every animal serves its purpose. You'd do well to remember that. Clara's first task was cleaning the bunkhouse, a low building that reeked of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco. The ranch hands watched her work with a mixture of pity and hunger that made her skin crawl. Some were young men broken by hard living, others were older hands, whose eyes held too much knowledge of violence. She kept her head down and her ears open, learning the rhythms of the place, cataloging potential allies and certain enemies. The foreman was a man named Vern Holt, tall and lean, with a face like carved granite and scars that spoke of a violent past. He wore his authority like a second skin, quick to bark orders and quicker still to enforce them with his fists. The other hands gave him a wide berth, and Clara soon learned why. She watched him beat a young cowboy senseless for the crime of looking at her too long, his movements precise and brutal as a butcher's. The girl's off limits. Vern announced to the assembled men afterward, wiping blood from his knuckles with casual indifference. Boss made that real clear. Anyone who forgets that fact will answer to me. The only kindness Clara found was in the barn, where a half-blind mule named Moses seemed to understand her grief. She would sit with him in the evenings, stroking his graying muzzle and whispering her fears to his patient ears. Moses had survived 20 years of hard labor through sheer stubbornness, and Clara drew strength from his quiet endurance. Luther kept her busy from dawn to dusk, cooking, cleaning, mending tasks designed to break her spirit through relentless drudgery. He would appear without warning to inspect her work, finding fault where none existed, using criticism as another tool of control. His presence filled rooms like smoke, poisoning the air with the threat of violence. "You're learning," he told her one evening, as she served his dinner with steady hands. "Good. Defiance is expensive, Clara. It costs more than most people can afford." She had learned not to respond to his provocations, had learned that silence was her only armor in this place. But at night alone in the tiny room he'd given her off the kitchen, she would stare out at the vast sky and remember what freedom looked like. The stars seemed impossibly distant, cold points of light in an endless darkness that reflected the isolation of her situation. The townspeople of Lonesome Spur were no help. When Luther brought her to the general store for supplies, they looked through her as if she were invisible. Mrs. Henderson, who had once praised Clara's sewing, now studied her boots with sudden fascination. Deputy Martinez, who had always tipped his hat to her on Sunday mornings, found urgent business elsewhere when Luther's shadow fell across the doorway. Fear was Luther's currency, and he had made himself rich beyond measure. Clara understood that she was utterly alone in this fight, surrounded by people too frightened to acknowledge her humanity. The realization should have broken her, but instead it hardened something deep inside her chest. If no one would help her, she would help herself. It was on a Tuesday that everything changed when a stranger rode into the valley like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared speak. Wes Callahan arrived in Lonesome Spur with nothing but the clothes on his back, a tired horse, and the kind of quiet desperation that marked a man running from his past. Clara first saw him outside Murphy's saloon, washing the trail dust from his face at the public trough. He was perhaps 30, lean and weathered, with sandy hair that fell across eyes the color of winter sky. There was something careful about the way he moved, something that spoke of violence learned and earned. The bartender, old Pete Murphy, sized him up with the practiced eye of a man who had seen every kind of trouble walk through his doors. "Looking for work. Whatever's available." Wes replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who didn't waste words. "Good with horses, cattle. Not afraid of hard work." Pete nodded toward the street. "Luther Crow's always looking for hands. Pays fair, but he's..." Pete searched for diplomatic words. "Particular about things." Wes had been in town less than an hour when he witnessed Luther's casual cruelty firsthand. Clara was loading supplies into Luther's wagon outside Henderson's general store when a sack of flour split, spilling white powder across the boardwalk. Luther's reaction was immediate and vicious, a backhanded blow that sent Clara stumbling into the wagon wheel, her lips splitting against the iron rim. "Clumsy bitch." Luther snarled loud enough for the entire street to hear. "Clean it up, every grain." Wes watched this tableau from across the street, his jaw tightening as Clara dropped to her knees to gather the scattered flour with her bare hands. The other townspeople found suddenly urgent business elsewhere. But Wes stayed his pale eyes, taking in every detail: the bruises on Clara's arms, the careful way she moved to avoid Luther's reach, and the defiance that still burned in her green gaze despite everything. When Luther noticed Wes watching, his hand dropped casually to his gun. "Something interesting, stranger. Just waiting my turn to talk to Henderson." Wes replied evenly. "Heard you might be hiring." Luther's eyes narrowed, calculating. He was always suspicious of new faces, but good hands were hard to find and harder to keep. "You know cattle. Worked drives from Texas to Kansas. Lost my last job when the railroad wars came through Colorado." It was the truth, or near enough. Wes had learned long ago that the best lies were built on foundations of fact. Railroad wars? Luther's smile was cold. "A lot of good men died in that mess. What happened to you? Wrong place at the wrong time. Happens to honest men sometimes." Wes met Luther's stare without flinching, a skill learned in harder places than this dying town. Clara finished gathering the flour, her movements careful and deliberate. As she rose to her feet, her eyes met Wes's for just a moment, a brief connection that passed like lightning between them. In that instant, he saw something that reminded him painfully of his sister Sarah, lost to men like Luther in another place, another time. Luther's decision was swift and characteristic. $15 a month plus board. You'll bunk with the other hands and take orders from my foreman, Vern Holt. Cross me once and you'll find yourself walking home. Cross me twice. He let the threat hang in the air like smoke. Fair enough. Wes said, though every instinct screamed at him to ride away from this place and its poisonous atmosphere. As Luther helped Clara into the wagon with mock courtesy, his grip lingering possessively on her arm, Wes felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. He had tried to leave violence behind, tried to bury the man he had been in Colorado. But watching Luther Crow treat a young woman like property awakened something in him that all the whiskey and miles couldn't kill. That night, as he settled into his bunk in the ranch's quarters, Wes Callahan made a decision that would change everything. He was going to help Clara Merrick, even if it killed them both. Luther's suspicions were as sharp as his cruelty, and Wes felt them like a weight on his shoulders from his first day at the ranch. The cattle baron had a way of appearing without warning, his pale eyes taking in every detail of his domain. During Wes's first week, Luther made his position crystal clear during a confrontation in the barn. "The girl," Luther said without preamble, his hand resting casually on his pearl-handled Colt. "I see how you look at her. Want to make sure we understand each other." Wes continued brushing down his horse, his movement steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "Don't know what you mean, boss. She belongs to me. Bought and paid for legal as Sunday church. Any man who forgets that fact tends to have accidents around here." Luther's voice was conversational, which made the threat more chilling than any shout. "Vern can tell you stories about men who got confused about what was theirs to touch. Just here to work cattle," Wes replied, finally turning to face Luther. "Girls, none of my business." Luther studied him for a long moment, his predator's instincts probing for weakness. "Good. Glad we understand each other. You seem like a smart man, Callahan. Smart men live longer in this country." But Luther's warnings couldn't stop Wes from seeing, and what he saw made his blood boil. Clara moved through the ranch like a ghost, always watchful, always wary. Her clothes were worn thin and patched, her hands raw from endless labor. At meals, she served the men in silence, her green eyes carefully averted her movements, economical and precise. The bruises told their own story, fingerprint marks on her arms, a split lip that healed only to split again, and the careful way she held her ribs when she thought no one was looking. Wes had seen enough violence to recognize its signature, and every mark on Clara's skin was like a nail driven into his conscience. His sister Sarah had been 19 when the mine bosses in Colorado decided she was fair game. Sarah had fought back, and they had killed her for it, dumping her body in a ravine like refuse. Wes had found her 3 days later, and the sight had changed him forever. He had become a different man that day, harder, colder, more dangerous. The kind of man who could track down Sarah's killers one by one and show them exactly what their cruelty had cost. Now, watching Clara endure Luther's systematic brutality, Wes felt that familiar rage stirring in his chest. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his fight, that he had paid enough prices already. But every time he saw her in the barn, whispering to the old mule like he was her only friend in the world, something in him cracked a little more. The first time he helped her was almost accidental. Clara was struggling to lift a heavy feed sack, her face pale with pain from some injury he couldn't see. Wes stepped forward without thinking, taking the sack from her hands before she could protest. "I can manage," she said quickly, her eyes darting toward the barn door where any of Luther's men might appear. "I know you can," Wes replied quietly. "Doesn't mean you should have to." For a moment, their hands touched on the rough burlap, and Wes felt the tremor that ran through her, not fear of him, but fear of being seen accepting help. In that touch, he understood the depth of her isolation and the careful walls she had built to survive. "Be careful," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "He's watching, always watching." After that, Wes was more cautious, but no less determined. He began leaving small gifts, where only Clara would find them: an apple from his own rations, a bit of salve for her cuts, a worn book of poetry he had carried since Colorado. Nothing that could be traced back to him, nothing that would put her in greater danger. But Vern Holt was watching too, and his scarred face held a suspicion that made Wes's skin crawl. The foreman had eyes like a snake, and the patience to match waiting for Wes to make a mistake that would justify the violence he so obviously craved. "A new man's getting mighty comfortable," Vern told Luther one evening, unaware that Wes was listening from the shadows outside the main house. "Spending a lot of time near the barn when the girl's working." The rising tension at the ranch was like a summer storm building on the horizon, inevitable, destructive, and dangerous to anyone caught in its path. Luther's paranoia grew with each passing day, his cruel attentions toward Clara intensifying, as if he could smell the rebellion brewing in the air. Wes found himself walking a razor's edge between helping Clara and preserving the fragile cover that kept them both alive. The first real test came during a brutal August heat wave that turned the ranch into a furnace of dust and desperation. The cattle were dying of thirst, the wells running low and tempers shorter than usual. Clara collapsed while hauling water buckets to the house, the relentless heat and Luther's increased workload finally overwhelming her 18-year-old frame. Wes found her crumpled beside the well, unconscious and burning with fever. For a moment, he forgot caution entirely, scooping her into his arms and carrying her to the shade of the barn. Her skin was paper white beneath the grime, her breathing shallow and rapid. He dipped his bandana in cool water and pressed it to her forehead, murmuring words of comfort he hadn't spoken since Sarah's death. "Easy now," he whispered. "You're safe. I've got you." Clara's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever. For a moment, she seemed to see through him to something else entirely. "Papa," she whispered, her voice cracked and desperate. "Papa, don't leave me here. Please don't leave me." The broken plea hit Wes like a physical blow. In her delirium, Clara was a child again, abandoned and frightened, betrayed by the one person who should have protected her. Wes felt his resolve harden into something unbreakable. Whatever the cost, he would not let Luther destroy her. Footsteps crunched in the gravel outside, and Wes's hand dropped instinctively to his gun. Vern Holt appeared in the barn doorway, his scarred face twisting into a knowing smile when he saw Clara in Wes's arms. Well, well. Vern drawled, his hand resting on his own weapon. What do we have here? Good Samaritan, are you? Girl collapsed from the heat. Wes said evenly, not moving from his protective position over Clara. Figured Luther wouldn't want his property damaged. Vern's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow with tobacco. His property, huh? That's real understanding of you, Callahan. Real respectful. He stepped closer, and Wes could smell the whiskey on his breath. Course man might wonder why you're being so careful with another man's property. Might make him think you got ideas above your station. The moment stretched between them like a wire drawn taut. Wes calculated distances, angles, the position of Vern's gun hand. He had killed men for less than the threat he heard in the foreman's voice. But starting a fight now would doom Clara, along with himself. Just doing what any decent man would do, Wes said finally. Decent. Vern tasted the word like something bitter. That's funny coming from a man with a price on his head. Wes's blood turned to ice water. Somehow Vern had learned about Colorado, about the bounty that followed him like a shadow. Don't know what you're talking about? Sure you don't. Vern's grin was savage now. Wesley Callahan, late of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, wanted for killing a Colorado state senator. $500 dead or alive. That's a lot of money for a working man like me. Clara stirred in Wes's arms, her fever-bright eyes beginning to focus. She looked between the two men, sensing the deadly tension without understanding its source. Wes helped her sit up his mind, racing through possibilities, none of them good. What do you want? Wes asked quietly. Oh, nothing for now. But you remember something, Callahan, your secret's safe, as long as you keep your hands to yourself. Start thinking you're some kind of hero, and I'll be collecting that bounty faster than you can blink. Vern touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. Pleasure doing business with you. As Vern walked away, whistling tunelessly, Wes felt the walls closing in around them. Clara was looking at him with new understanding, her green eyes wide with shock and something that might have been betrayal. You're running from the law, she whispered. Wes nodded, unable to meet her gaze. Man I killed deserved it. But the law doesn't always care about deserving. Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite her illness. What did he do? Killed my sister. Used his power to cover it up, bought judges to look the other way. So I became judge and jury myself. Wes's voice was flat, emotionless. Made me into something I swore I'd never be again. Clara reached out with trembling fingers and touched his hand. I'm sorry about your sister. The simple gesture of comfort nearly undid him. In all the months since Colorado, no one had offered him sympathy or understanding. Everyone saw only the wanted man, the killer, the dangerous stranger to be avoided. But Clara saw something else. She saw the brother who had failed to protect someone he loved. That night, as Wes lay in his bunk, listening to the restless cattle and the whispered conversations of the other hands, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Vern's threat had made one thing crystal clear. Staying at the ranch was a death sentence for both him and Clara. But running would mean abandoning her to Luther's mercy, and Wes had already failed one woman he cared about. He chose to stay, knowing it would probably kill them both. But some choices were worth dying for, and Clara Merrick had become one of them. The decision would prove more costly than he imagined when he learned the truth about Luther Crow's empire and the violent reckoning that was already riding toward them across the desert. The truth about Luther Crow's empire came to Wes in fragments like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting a distorted reality. It began with whispered conversations between the ranch hands, nervous words about mysterious visitors who came in the dark, about shipments that arrived without explanation, about men who worked for Luther but never seemed to handle cattle. Wes's training as a Pinkerton had taught him to recognize the signs of criminal enterprise, and the Crow Ranch reeked of it. Too many hard men for a simple cattle operation. Too much money flowing through a place that claimed to be struggling with drought and market prices. Too many locked doors and suspicious glances when strangers appeared. The revelation came on a moonless night in late August, when Wes couldn't sleep and decided to check on the horses. He was crossing the yard when he heard voices from Luther's study, angry, urgent voices that carried clearly through the open window. "You killed my brother Crow." The speaker had a Mexican accent, cultured, but edged with barely controlled rage. "Did you think the Morales family would forget?" Luther's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Your brother was stealing from me. I don't tolerate thieves. He was exposing your operation to the authorities. There's a difference." A second voice joined the conversation, this one harder, more dangerous. "You've been smuggling guns to the Apache, selling information to the highest bidder, blackmailing half the territorial government." Eduardo was going to end all of that. Eduardo was a fool with a guilty conscience, just like you apparently. The sound of a gun being cocked carried clearly through the still air. "You boys have 10 seconds to get off my land before I solve this problem permanently. This isn't over, Crow. The Morales family has a long memory and deep pockets. We'll be back with enough men to turn your little kingdom into a graveyard." Wes pressed himself against the barn wall as two shadowy figures emerged from the house and disappeared into the darkness. Luther's empire was built on blood and betrayal, and now that empire was about to face a reckoning. Wes felt a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach as he realized what this meant for Clara. The next morning brought a new level of tension to the ranch. Luther was edgier than usual, snapping at the hands for minor infractions, his pale eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting attack. He doubled the guard posts and ordered all the men to go armed at all times. "Might be some trouble coming," he announced during breakfast, his voice carefully casual. "Indian raids have been increasing lately. Want everyone ready for anything." But Wes knew better, and his knowledge made him reckless. He began taking greater risks to help Clara, driven by the certainty that time was running out for all of them. He smuggled her extra food, small weapons hidden where only she would find them, and most dangerously, he began meeting with her in secret. Their first real conversation took place in the root cellar beneath the main house, a damp, shadowy space that smelled of earth and preserves. Clara had been sent to retrieve canned peaches for Luther's dinner, and Wes followed her down his heart, hammering with the risk they were taking. "Now we need to get you out of here," he said without preamble. "Luther's made enemies, dangerous ones. This place is going to become a battlefield." Clara's green eyes searched his face in the dim light. "You want to help me escape? I want to help you live. There's a difference." Wes stepped closer, his voice urgent and low. "I've got money saved enough to get you somewhere safe. California, maybe, or back east, where Luther's influence doesn't reach." "Why?" The question was simple, but Wes heard layers of meaning in it. Why risk his life for a stranger? Why care about one more victim in a world full of suffering? "Because I couldn't save my sister," he said honestly. "Because letting Luther destroy you would make me complicit in your murder. Because—" he struggled for words that wouldn't sound like empty sentiment. "Because you deserve better than this." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust on a preserve jar. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to dream about being rescued. Some knight on a white horse who would take me away from all this." She looked up at him, and her smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. "But I'm not a child anymore, Mr. Callahan. I know there are no knights, Maybe not, but there are men willing to try. Before Clara could respond, footsteps echoed on the stairs above them. They sprang apart like guilty children as Vern Holt's bulk filled the cellar doorway, his scarred face twisting into a knowing leer. Well, well. What do we have here? Private meetings in dark places. Vern's hand rested on his gun, and his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had finally caught his prey. Boss is gonna be real interested in this. Clara stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. I dropped the preserves. Mr. Callahan was helping me clean them up. Vern's gaze swept the cellar, taking in the unbroken jars and the lack of any spilled fruit. His smile widened. That's real thoughtful of him. Real intimate. He gestured toward the stairs with the barrel of his gun. Both of you up. Boss wants to see his property. They climbed the stairs in silence. Wes's mind racing through options, all of them bad. Luther was waiting in his study, his pale eyes glittering with cold fury. Behind him stood two men Wes didn't recognize, hard-faced gunmen, with the kind of easy confidence that came from killing without conscience. Vern tells me you've been getting mighty friendly with my girl, Luther said conversationally. That true Callahan, I helped her carry some supplies, nothing more. Luther's backhand caught Wes across the face, the rings on his fingers opening cuts that would scar. Don't lie to me, boy. I can smell the lies on you like cheap perfume. Clara started forward, her face white with anger, but Luther's casual gesture stopped her cold. Move another inch, girl, and I'll have Vern put a bullet in your knight's brain. Please. Clara whispered, her defiance crumbling into desperate fear. Don't hurt him. It was my fault. I asked for help. Luther's smile was terrible in its satisfaction. Oh, I know whose fault it is. Question is, what am I going to do about it? He walked to his desk and withdrew a length of chain from a drawer. Vern, take our Romeo here to the storm cellar. Chain him up nice and tight. Maybe a few days in the dark will remind him who owns what around here. As Vern forced Wes toward the door at gunpoint, Luther caught Clara's arm with bruising force. As for you, my dear, you're going to learn what happens to property that forgets its place. The storm cellar was a concrete tomb beneath the barn, accessible only through a heavy wooden door that Vern locked with obvious pleasure. Wes found himself chained to the wall in absolute darkness, listening to the scurrying of rats and the distant sound of Clara's screams. 3 days in the storm cellar taught Wes Callahan the true meaning of helplessness. The concrete walls wept moisture that pooled on the floor, creating a clammy chill that seeped into his bones. The chain around his ankle was thick iron, anchored to a bolt driven deep into the stone foundation. He had tested every link, every connection, until his fingers bled from the effort. Above him, life at the ranch continued with its brutal rhythm. He could hear the sound of boots on wooden floors, muffled conversations, and worst of all, Clara's voice raised in pain or protest. Each cry was like a knife in his chest, a reminder of his failure to protect her when she needed him most. Vern brought him water twice a day, and stale bread, once taking obvious pleasure in Wes's degradation. Boss is real upset with you, he said during one visit, crouching just outside Wes's reach. Been taking his feelings out on that girl. You should hear her beg. The words were calculated to drive Wes into a fury. But 3 days of forced meditation had taught him patience. He met Vern's gaze calmly and spoke in a voice like winter wind. When I get out of here, I'm going to kill you. Vern laughed, but there was something nervous in the sound. Big talk from a man in chains. Not a boast, a promise. You can take that to the bank. On the third night, everything changed. Wes was dozing fitfully when the sound of gunshots jolted him awake. Not the casual firing of ranch hands practicing their aim, but the rapid, desperate staccato of a firefight. Shouts echoed across the yard, boots pounded on wooden steps, and somewhere in the chaos, he heard Clara scream. The Morales family had come calling just as they'd promised. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes. Wes listened to the ebb and flow of violence, trying to piece together the story from sound alone. The attackers had caught the ranch partially off guard, but Luther's men were fighting back with the desperate ferocity of cornered animals. When the shooting finally stopped, an eerie quiet settled over the ranch. Wes strained his ears, trying to determine who had won when footsteps approached the cellar door. The heavy bolt scraped back and lamplight spilled down the stairs. To his surprise, it was Clara who appeared, her face streaked with soot and tears, a ring of keys clutched in her trembling hands. "They're all dead," she whispered, kneeling beside him to unlock the chain. "The Mexican men, Luther's gunfighters, everyone. The ranch is burning." Wes struggled to his feet, his legs cramping from 3 days of confinement. What about Luther Vern? Luther barricaded himself in the house with some of his men. The Mexicans set it on fire. Clara's voice was flat, emotionless. "I heard them screaming inside, but the doors were too heavy to break down. They burned alive." As they climbed out of the cellar, Wes saw the full extent of the carnage. Bodies lay scattered across the yard like broken dolls, and the main house was a roaring inferno that painted the night sky orange. The barn was already catching fire, and the terrified lowing of trapped cattle filled the air. "We need to get out of here," Wes said, taking Clara's hand. "Gather what you can carry, food, water, weapons." But Clara pulled back, her green eyes reflecting the flames. "Wait, there's something you need to know about Vern." Before she could explain, a voice called out from the shadows near the burning barn. "Clara, Clara, where are you?" Vern Holt emerged from the smoke like something out of a nightmare. His clothes singed his scarred face, blackened with soot. He was limping heavily, favoring his left leg, but his gun was steady in his hand. "There you are," he said, relief and something else flickering in his eyes. "When I saw the fire, I thought I'd lost you again." Wes stepped protectively in front of Clara, his hand moving instinctively to where his gun should have been. Again, Clara's voice was barely audible above the crackling flames. "Vern is my brother, my half-brother. I thought he was dead." The revelation hit Wes like a physical blow. He looked between Clara and Vern, seeing the family resemblance now that he knew to look for it. The same stubborn jaw, the same green eyes, the same proud carriage that refused to bow even in defeat. Vernon Merrick. Vern said, his voice rough with emotion. "That was my name before I became Vern Holt. Before I learned that names don't matter much when you're fighting for your life." Clara took a step toward him, her hand outstretched. "I mourned you. Papa told me you died in a mining accident in Colorado. Papa sold me too," Vern said bitterly. "Different buyers, same result. Man named Fletcher bought my labor contract, worked me like a dog in his silver mine. When I got old enough to fight back, I killed him and took his name." His eyes found Wes, and there was something like respect in them. "Guess that makes us both Killers Callahan." The burning ranch created an apocalyptic backdrop for this family reunion, and the flames casting wild shadows that danced like demons across the blood-soaked ground. Wes felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Vern's protective behavior toward Clara, his reluctance to harm her, even when she defied Luther, the way he had used Wes's secret as leverage, rather than simply turning him in for the bounty. "You knew," Wes said. "When you caught us in the cellar, you knew who she was." Vern nodded, his scarred face twisting with pain that had nothing to do with his injuries. "Been watching over her for 2 years, ever since I tracked down James Merrick and learned what he'd done. Couldn't reveal myself without blowing my cover, but I made sure Luther never hurt her too badly. Made sure she stayed alive." Clara stared at her brother, her emotions warring between joy at finding him alive and rage at his deception. "You let me think I was alone. You watched Luther hurt me and did nothing. I did what I could. Vern's voice cracked with anguish. You think it was easy watching him treat you like property? Every time he laid a hand on you, I wanted to kill him. But if I'd blown my cover, he would have killed us both. The sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation like a blade. Through the smoke and flames, Wes could see riders approaching more of the Morales family's men come to finish what they'd started. We need to go, he said urgently. Now. But Clara wasn't finished with her brother. Why didn't you help me escape? Why didn't you get me away from here? Vern's answer came out in a rush, desperate and raw. Because I was planning to kill Luther myself. Had it all worked out, make it look like an accident, inherit his operation, use his own network against him. But then the Morales family showed up and... He gestured helplessly at the burning ranch. The approaching riders were close enough now that Wes could see their weapons, could hear their voices calling back and forth in rapid Spanish. They had perhaps minutes before the new arrivals decided to finish off any surviving witnesses. Family reunion's going to have to wait, Wes said, grabbing both Clara and Vern by the arms. Those men aren't interested in taking prisoners. As they stumbled toward the corral, where a few terrified horses milled in panic, Wes couldn't help but marvel at the cruel irony of the situation. He had come to the ranch to help Clara escape from one kind of prison, only to discover that her supposed enemy was actually her protector, and her real family was more complicated than either of them had imagined. The final confrontation began not with a dramatic showdown, but with the desperate flight of 3 survivors through a landscape painted red by flame and blood. Clara, Wes, and Vern managed to catch 3 horses from the panicked herd, their mounts dancing sideways from the smell of smoke and death that clung to everything. Behind them, the Morales riders had discovered the bodies in the yard and were systematically searching every building that hadn't been consumed by fire. Their voices carried clearly in the still night air. Angry, urgent commands in Spanish, punctuated by the occasional gunshot as they put wounded horses out of their misery. They'll follow us, Vern said as they rode hard toward the foothills. The Morales family doesn't leave loose ends. Clara rode between the 2 men, her face pale but determined in the moonlight. How many of them? Enough, Vern replied grimly. Eduardo Morales was their youngest son, and they loved him like a prince. They won't stop until everyone connected to his death is in the ground. They rode through the night, following game trails that wound between rocky outcroppings and stands of scrub oak. The horses were tired from the long day and the terror of the fire, but fear drove them forward at a pace that left all 3 riders aching in their saddles. As dawn approached, they took shelter in a narrow canyon that offered both water and concealment. While the horses drank gratefully from a small stream, the 3 survivors faced each other across a dying campfire and tried to make sense of their situation. We can't run forever, Clara said, her voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. They'll track us down eventually. Wes nodded, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. Then we make a stand. Pick our ground fight on our terms, against a dozen armed men. Vern shook his head. That's suicide. Maybe. But it's better than being hunted like animals. Wes met Clara's eyes across the fire. There's something else. Something I should have told you before. Clara's green gaze was steady, accepting. The man you killed in Colorado? There's more to that story. Senator Blackwood wasn't just my sister's killer. He was part of a network, politicians, businessmen, lawmen, all of them covering for each other's crimes. When I killed him, I didn't just murder one man. I declared war on the whole system. Wes's voice was quiet, matter of fact. There are more bounties on my head than just the official one. Every corrupt official in 3 territories wants me dead. Vern leaned forward, his scarred face intent. What are you saying? I'm saying that running isn't an option for me. It never was. I can keep moving for a while, but eventually they'll corner me. And when that happens? He looked at Clara, his expression soft with regret. I don't want you caught in that crossfire. Before Clara could respond, the sound of horses echoed from the mouth of the canyon. Their pursuers had found them moving with the patient efficiency of professional manhunters. Wes counted at least 8 riders armed with rifles, and the kind of grim determination that came from blood debts and family honor. End of the trail. Vern said, checking his ammunition with steady hands. But Clara surprised them both by standing up, her chin raised in defiance. No, not yet. She walked to her saddlebags and withdrew something that made both men stare in shock, a bundle of papers wrapped in oiled cloth. Luther's records. She explained, her voice gaining strength. Every dirty deal, every bribe, every murder. I've been stealing pages from his ledgers for months, copying down names and dates. Everything he did, everyone he worked with, it's all here. Wes felt his heart skip a beat. Clara, do you know what you're holding? Enough evidence to hang half the territorial government, Vern said in amazement. No wonder Luther kept you so close. You weren't just his property, you were his insurance policy. Clara's smile was sharp as a blade. And now it's mine. She called out in Spanish, her voice carrying clearly to the approaching riders. I want to speak to Rodriguez Morales. Tell him I have something he wants. The horses stopped just inside the canyon mouth, and after a brief conference, one man rode forward alone. He was middle-aged, with silver threading his black hair, and the kind of face that spoke of intelligence tempered by violence. The family resemblance to the dead Eduardo was unmistakable. I am Rodriguez, he said in accented English. You have something to say before you die. Clara held up the bundle of papers. Your brother died because he was going to expose Luther Crow's operation to the territorial authorities. These documents contain everything Eduardo would have needed to bring down the whole network. Rodriguez's eyes sharpened with interest. Continue. Let us go and I'll give you these papers. You can finish what Eduardo started, bring real justice instead of just revenge. Clara's voice was steady, authoritative. Or you can kill us and watch the corruption continue unchecked. For a long moment, Rodriguez studied her with calculating eyes. Then he smiled, and it was like sunrise after a long night. Eduardo would have liked you, señorita. You have his courage. He gestured to his men, who lowered their weapons. The papers, and we will consider the debt settled. Clara walked forward slowly, the precious documents in her hands. But just as she reached the midpoint between the two groups, Vern's voice rang out in warning. Clara, get down. A rifle cracked from the canyon rim above them, and Rodriguez pitched backward from his saddle, blood blooming across his chest. More shots followed, and suddenly the narrow canyon became a killing ground as hidden gunmen opened fire from the rocks above. Through the chaos and gun smoke, Wes saw them territorial marshals led by a man he recognized from his Pinkerton days. Deputy Marshal Crenshaw, one of Senator Blackwood's bought men, had found them at last. The corrupt lawmen had been tracking Wes across 3 states, and now they intended to eliminate all the witnesses to their crimes. It's a trap, Vern shouted, diving for cover behind a boulder as bullets whined off the rocks around them. Clara clutched the papers to her chest as she scrambled for safety, her face white with shock. The Morales men were caught in the open, their horses screaming and rearing as lead filled the air. Some of them managed to find cover, others fell where they stood, victims of an ambush they never saw coming. Wes found himself pressed against a rock wall beside Clara, his gun in his hand, his mind racing through tactical options. Above them, at least 6 rifles were firing with professional precision. Behind them, the canyon walls rose sheer and unclimbable. They were trapped, outgunned, and running out of ammunition fast. The papers. Clara gasped, trying to protect the documents from the flying dirt and debris. We can't let them get the papers. Well, why? Wes demanded, reloading his weapon with practiced speed. What good are they if we're dead? Clara's answer came as another revelation that changed everything. Because Luther wasn't the only one keeping records. I've been writing letters, sending copies of evidence to newspapers in San Francisco and Denver. If we die here, it all comes out anyway. But if we live... She looked at him with fierce determination. If we live, we can control how the story gets told. The revelation that Clara had been playing a deeper game than anyone realized sent a shock of admiration through Wes. She hadn't been just a victim waiting for rescue. She had been building her own network, preparing her own revenge, using Luther's arrogance against him in ways that made Wes's simple plan of escape look naive. Above them, Marshal Crenshaw's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Callahan, I know you're down there. Give yourself up and we'll make it quick. Keep fighting and we'll take our time with the girl." Wes felt the familiar cold rage settle over him, the same deadly calm that had carried him through the Colorado incident. He turned to Vern, who was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, but still fighting with grim efficiency. "How many rounds you got left?" "Maybe a dozen. About the same." Wes looked at Clara, memorizing her face, in case this was goodbye. "Those letters you sent, when will they be published?" "Next week if I don't send word to stop them." Clara's smile was fierce and beautiful. "I may die here, but Luther's network dies with me." From somewhere behind the rocks, Rodriguez Morales called out weakly. The Morales patriarch was wounded, but alive, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived 40 years of border violence. "Señorita," he gasped. "The papers. Throw them to my men. Let my family finish what Eduardo started." Clara looked at the bundle in her hands, then at Wes and Vern. "If I give these to them, the corruption ends. But we all die. Maybe not all of us." Wes said quietly, "I've got an idea. But it means I don't walk away from this." Before Clara could protest, Wes was moving, sprinting across the open ground toward the canyon mouth, where the marshal's horses waited unguarded. Bullets whined around him like angry wasps, but his timing was perfect. When the hidden gunman had to reload, giving him precious seconds of cover. He reached the horses just as the shooting resumed, diving behind the animals for cover. With swift, brutal efficiency, he cut the picket lines and sent the horses stampeding back down the canyon, depriving the marshals of their escape route. "Now they're trapped too," he called back to Clara and Vern. "Even if they kill us, they're not getting out of here alive." The tactical situation had shifted, but it was still desperate. The marshals had the high ground and more ammunition, but now they faced the same problem as their quarry: no way out of the canyon except through their enemies. Marshal Crenshaw seemed to realize this, because his next words carried a note of negotiation. "All right, Callahan. You want to play it hard? Let's deal. The girl and her brother can walk away. You come up here with your hands empty, and this ends." "Don't trust him," Clara called out. "He'll kill us all anyway." Wes knew she was right, but he also knew that their ammunition wouldn't last much longer. The standoff would end in death for all of them unless someone took decisive action. He made his choice with the cold clarity of a man who had already died once in Colorado and been living on borrowed time ever since. "Vern," he called softly, "take care of your sister, and Clara, make sure those letters get published. The world needs to know." What followed was a masterpiece of violence and sacrifice that would be remembered in border legend for generations. Wes Callahan rose from cover like an avenging angel, his guns blazing, as he charged directly up the canyon wall toward the marshal's position. It was suicide, but it was also brilliant. His desperate assault drew all the enemy fire, giving Clara and Vern the opening they needed. The surviving Morales men seized the moment, their own weapons barking, as they poured fire into the marshal's position from below. Caught between two forces, Crenshaw's corrupt lawmen found themselves outflanked and outgunned despite their superior numbers. Wes made it halfway up the rock face before a rifle bullet caught him in the chest, spinning him around and sending him tumbling back down to the canyon floor. But his charge had done its work. 3 of the marshals were down, and the others were trapped in a crossfire that was rapidly becoming untenable. Clara reached Wes first, her hands trying desperately to staunch the blood flowing from his wounds. His eyes were still clear, still focused, but she could see death approaching like a shadow across his face. "The letters," he whispered, his voice weak but urgent. "Promise me." "I promise," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "But you're going to live to see them published. You're going to see justice done." Wes smiled, and for a moment he looked younger, less haunted. "I already have. I gotta help you. That's more justice than I ever thought I'd see." The battle above them was reaching its climax. Vern had worked his way around to flank the remaining marshals, while Rodriguez Morales directed his men's fire with tactical precision despite his wounds. One by one, the corrupt lawmen fell, until only Marshal Crenshaw remained trapped behind a boulder with nowhere to run. "It's over, Crenshaw," Vern called out. "Come down with your hands up and we'll let you live to see trial." But Crenshaw had been bought and paid for too long to surrender now. His response was a final, desperate charge down the canyon wall, his gun blazing as he sought to take at least one of his enemies with him to hell. Clara rose to meet him, Luther's own pearl-handled Colt steady in her hands. The 2 shots came so close together, they sounded like one echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Crenshaw's bullet went wide, thrown off by a wound in his gun arm. Clara's found its mark, sending the corrupt marshal tumbling into the stream, where his blood mingled with the clear water. In the sudden silence that followed, Clara knelt beside Wes again, her face streaked with tears and gunpowder. He was still breathing, but barely, his life ebbing away, like the stream that ran red with their enemy's blood. "Did we win?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara looked around at the carnage-dead marshals scattered across the rocks, Rodriguez Morales wounded but alive, her brother Vern, bloodied but victorious. Most importantly, the bundle of papers that would expose Luther's network was still safe in her hands. "Yes," she said firmly, "we won." Wes closed his eyes, and Clara thought he was gone. But then he spoke one last time, his words carrying clearly in the desert air. "Sarah," he whispered. "I kept my promise, Sarah. I didn't let them break another one." And then Wesley Callahan was still his long hunt for justice, finally ended in a canyon that would forever bear the stains of corrupt blood and honest sacrifice. The aftermath of the canyon battle rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, carrying consequences that no one could have foreseen. Clara sat beside Wes's body for a long time, her hand resting on his still chest, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Rodriguez Morales survived his wounds, though he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. As his men tended to their dead and wounded, he approached Clara with the careful respect due to a fellow survivor of violence. "The papers, señorita. My brother's death will have meaning if you give them to us." Clara looked down at the blood-stained documents in her hands, Luther's careful records of bribery, blackmail, and murder. They represented years of systematic corruption, a network of evil that stretched from territorial capitals to Washington itself. "Take them," she said simply. "But remember, this isn't about revenge anymore. It's about justice. Real justice, the kind your brother Eduardo believed in." Rodriguez nodded solemnly. "You have my word. The Morales family will see this done properly through the courts and the newspapers. No more killing." As the Morales men prepared to leave, carrying their dead and wounded, Vern approached his sister with tentative steps. The reunion they had both dreamed of was tainted now by blood and loss, but the love between them remained strong as ever. "What will you do now?" he asked, his scarred face gentle with concern. Clara looked back toward the burned remains of the Crow Ranch, visible as a smudge of smoke on the distant horizon. "I'm going back. Clara, there's nothing left. The place is destroyed. The buildings are destroyed. The land remains." Her voice was quiet but filled with determination. Luther Crow built that ranch on blood money and fear. I'm going to rebuild it on something better." Vern studied his sister's face, seeing something in her expression that reminded him of their mother, a stubborn strength that could move mountains through sheer force of will. "You mean to turn it into something else entirely? A refuge. A place where women like me can go when they have nowhere else to turn. Where they can learn to fight back, to stand up for themselves." Clara's green eyes blazed with purpose. "Luther made that place into a prison. I'm going to make it into a sanctuary." The journey back to the ranch took 3 days, during which Clara and Vern slowly rebuilt the relationship that violence and separation had fractured. They buried Wes Callahan on a hill overlooking the valley, marking his grave with a simple wooden cross that bore the inscription, "He kept his promise, his." The ranch itself was a ruin, just as Vern had predicted. The main house was a skeleton of charred timber, the barn a pile of ash and twisted metal. But the land was good. The water rights were secure, and most importantly, the fear that had poisoned the place was gone forever. Clara's first act was symbolic but powerful. She took a sledgehammer to the storm cellar where she had been imprisoned, reducing the concrete walls to rubble. Then she began the long work of rebuilding not just the physical structures, but the very soul of the place. Word spread quickly through the territory about what had happened at the Crow Ranch. The newspapers that published Clara's evidence created a sensation that reached all the way to Washington, triggering investigations and arrests that would continue for years. Several territorial officials fled to Mexico rather than face trial, while others committed suicide rather than endure the shame of exposure. But Clara's most important work was quieter, more personal. The first woman to seek sanctuary at the new ranch was Maria Santos, a Mexican girl whose husband had sold her to pay gambling debts. Then came Sarah Pine, a widow, whose brother-in-law claimed ownership of her children. One by one, they came women with nowhere else to turn, carrying nothing but hope and the willingness to fight for something better. Vern stayed to help, using his knowledge of Luther's network to identify other women who needed help. Together, the Merrick siblings built something unprecedented in the territory, a place where women could learn to read and write, to handle firearms, and manage finances, to stand up for themselves in a world that saw them as property. The townspeople of Lonesome Spur were initially suspicious of the changes. Some of the men grumbled about uppity women and unnatural ideas. But when those same women began spending money in town, buying supplies and services with wages earned from legitimate work, opposition faded into grudging acceptance. 6 months after the battle in the canyon, Clara received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Sarah Callahan, Wes's sister, who had somehow survived the violence in Colorado and made her way to California. The letter was brief but heartfelt. "Miss Merrick, I read about my brother's death in the San Francisco Chronicle. The article said he died protecting you from corrupt lawmen. I wanted you to know that Wesley always blamed himself for my troubles, though they were never his fault. If he found peace in helping you, then his death has meaning. I am proud to have called him brother. Your friend Sarah Callahan." The letter became one of Clara's most treasured possessions, kept in a place of honor beside the cross that marked Wes's grave. She would read it aloud sometimes to the women who sought sanctuary at the ranch, as a reminder that even in the darkest times, people could choose to do good. Years passed, and the ranch that had once been a symbol of oppression became a beacon of hope throughout the territory. Clara never married, dedicating her life entirely to the women who needed her help. But she was never alone, surrounded by sisters in struggle, supported by a brother who had learned that true strength came from protection rather than domination. On a morning in late spring, 5 years after the battle that changed everything, Clara stood on the front porch of the new house she had built, where Luther's mansion once stood. The architecture was different now, open and welcoming rather than fortress-like, with wide windows that let in light and air instead of narrow slits designed for defense. The valley below was green with new grass, dotted with cattle that bore the new brand Clara had designed, not the aggressive C, that Luther had burned into everything he owned, but a simple circle with a star at its center representing unity and hope. The women who worked the ranch moved with confidence and purpose, their children playing freely in the yard without fear. Vern approached from the barn, his limp more pronounced than it had been, but his spirit unbroken. In his hands, he carried a telegram that had arrived that morning with a supply wagon from town. "The news from the territorial capital," he said, handing her the yellow paper. "Thought you'd want to see this." Clara unfolded the telegram and read its contents with growing amazement. The territorial legislature had passed a new law, the Merrick Act, named in her honor, that made it illegal to sell or trade women as property. It was the first law of its kind in the American West, and its passage had been directly inspired by the evidence she had gathered from Luther's files. "They named it after you," Vern said with obvious pride. "The whole territory will know what you accomplished here." Clara smiled, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on a quiet grave on the hillside, where wildflowers grew around a simple wooden cross. "We accomplished, brother. We all accomplished." She folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into her pocket. "But this is just the beginning. There's still so much work to do." As she spoke, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, another wagon approaching the ranch. Clara shaded her eyes against the sun, making out the familiar shape of Doc Peterson's medical wagon. The old doctor made regular visits to the ranch, now treating the women who arrived with injuries, both physical and emotional. But this time, he wasn't alone. Walking beside the wagon was a young woman Clara didn't recognize, small and dark-haired, with the careful posture of someone who had learned to expect violence. Another refugee, another soul seeking sanctuary in a world that saw women as disposable. "Looks like we have a new arrival," Vern observed. Clara nodded, already moving toward the approaching wagon. This was her calling now, her life's work, providing hope to those who had none, strength to those who had been broken, and most importantly proving that even in the harshest landscape, something beautiful could grow. The young woman looked up as Clara approached, her dark eyes wide with uncertainty and fear. Clara had seen that look 1,000 times before, the desperate hope of someone who had heard rumors of a place where women could be safe, mixed with the fear that it might be too good to be true. "Welcome to the Circle Star Ranch," Clara said gently, extending her hand in friendship. "My name is Clara Merrick. What's yours?" "Isabella," the young woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Isabella Cruz. I heard you help women like me." "We help women like us," Clara corrected with a warm smile. "All of us. Because we're all in this together, and none of us is alone." As she led Isabella toward the house, where a warm meal and safe bed waited, Clara caught sight of the sun glinting off the cross on the hillside. For just a moment, she could almost hear Wes Callahan's voice on the wind, speaking words he had once written in a letter left behind. "The world breaks us all, but it's what we build after that matters." Clara Merrick had been broken, once sold like cattle to a man who saw her as property. But she had rebuilt herself into something stronger, something that could not be owned or controlled or destroyed. And in doing so, she had created a legacy that would outlast all the men who had tried to break her. The Circle Star Ranch stood as proof that even in the Wild West, where might too often made right, there was still room for justice, compassion, and hope. It was a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change, written in the language of courage and sacrifice across a landscape that had seen too much of both. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara stood on her porch and watched the lights come on in the bunkhouses where free women lived as equals. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed peacefully in the gathering dusk, and children's laughter echoed across the yard. It was the sound of freedom, and it was the most beautiful music Clara Merrick had ever heard. The story that had begun with coins jingling in a desperate father's fist had ended with something far more valuable. The knowledge that Even in the darkest places, hope could take root and grow into something magnificent. And in the years to come, whenever someone asked about the woman who turned a cattle baron's empire into a sanctuary for the lost and broken, the old-timers would smile and tell them about Clara Merrick, who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice was simply refusing to be broken.